Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to you calling in from the States. Welcome to our webinar on seizing the 5G enterprise opportunity, how to drive operator agility. So we've got a pretty busy schedule here today. First up, we're going to be just a little bit of introductions so that those of you who are not familiar with this particular webinar platform, give you a little bit of guidance on that. And then we're going to take you through a presentation of the recent findings of our research on operator agility and how operators are adopting more agile practices. And that'll be my colleagues, Yasmin and Yannick. And then we've got a panelist discussion, and I'll take you through the panelists in a second before having a Q&A to allow you, the audience, to put your questions to us and the panelists here today. So, very quickly, just introduce the rundown today. We've got a webinar, you're in listen-only mode, and if you have any issues and you're having problems with the technology, you can contact us and our team of technicians will try and help you out. Throughout the session, you're invited to submit your questions that we'll address at the end, and those questions we're unable to address today, we will seek to respond in the coming days and send back to all of the participants. And we'll also send you a recording, a link to the recording, and we'll send you a copy of the slides. Do feel free to tweet us and to share with your colleagues and invite them to listen back. Right, so that's the webinar platform. Now we'd like to kick off and just introduce today's speakers and panelists. So there's myself, I'm the Consulting Director at STL Partners, and my colleagues Yasmin and Yannick will be taking us through their recent research that we've undertaken. And then we're joined for a panel session by Rosemary from Telia, and she's going to share her experience of driving agile transformation within the enterprise communication product arena. We're also joined by Etishan, who's got a lot of experience of developing ecosystems for operators and operator ecosystems, and has recently been leading TM Forum Catalyst project. And Miriam is joining us, who's from the Ericsson Digital Services Senior Solutions Marketing Manager for BSS. So that's our presenters and our panelists for today. I'd like to now hand over to Yasmin and get her to take us through our findings.
Great, thanks, Phil. So for this part of the webinar, Yannick and I will be presenting our findings from a research program, as Phil mentioned, that we've conducted recently with operators globally. So just for context, for this research, we had spoken to a number of different operators globally from different roles, different organizations as part of this research. And our focus was to understand what agility means to operators today in the context of 5G and the enterprise opportunity, how operators have progressed in the last few years in driving agility, some of the challenges that they're facing, which ones are the most pervasive, and also what they can do to overcome them. But before we dive in, we'd love to understand a little bit more in terms of who's listening today and your perspective on this. So we're going to kick things off with an audience poll. Before we flash that up, I'm going to run through the few options with you. So number one is about agility is not on our radar, and we recognize if you're a company that works with operators, then you can share where you see your customers. So back to the answers. Number two, you're still in the early stages of this, and there's a lot to be done to define your agility roadmap. Three, you have a clear plan and alignment within your organization, but it's still early days. Or four, you have started but are currently rethinking and realigning on what that broader agility roadmap is. And five, you're well underway. So you should see a poll launch in just a second. And you should be able to select one option. So just to recap, this is where you see your organization in its agility journey today, or if you're a company that works with operators, where do you see the majority of your customers today? I see people slowly, we're getting answers in, and we will give everyone a few more seconds, and once we get most of the responses, we will then share back the results. So this is about either agility is not on your radar today, or the other end of the spectrum where this has been a key focus for your organization for many years, and your transformation, agile transformation initiative is well established. Great. I can see the results now. Interesting. We have a nice spread across options 2, 3, and 4 around operators who are a little bit earlier in their journey and are looking to still define that roadmap, all the way through to those who are actually rethinking and realigning on their agility strategy. And there are also a fair about 13% of those who have said that actually they see themselves as being much more ahead and having their agile transformations being well established within their organizations. Great. So we're going to jump back to the presentation now. So what we wanted to do is just recap the three highlight findings of the research. So the first one is about the relevance of agility and how that's changed in the past few years. The second is about what agility means and what this looks like in practice, and what are the key challenges in embracing this. And the final key finding that we'll dive into more detail is about what we see as the key steps that operators should be taking in driving what we're calling the agility flywheel. So just to dive down into the first finding. So in our research, we found that agility is now seen as a much more of a must-have for operators. And although the definition of agility is as broad as when we did a similar research program 6 years ago, we found that many of the concepts have crystallized in meaning. So before, the concept of agility was only largely embraced by IT and by siloed pockets within the organization. It often then lacked the clarity needed to drive major changes. But now we see that it's much more broadly accepted and embraced within and across the organization. And 5 years ago, when operators were still sort of grappling with the necessary sort of IT and network transformations, for example, with the NFV SDN and the virtualization of the network, but now operators have made progress on those fronts. And since I think the move to more cloud native models is now seen to be much more applicable across all areas of the business and not just within IT. So why now? We see 3 key reasons on why agility is actually more relevant than ever. Number 1 is just about competition. And this is not just competition from other operators, but more from the hyperscale cloud providers, from innovative startups and software companies that are more digital than cloud native from the cloud up, from the ground up. Sorry. Number 2 is about the customer demands. So as a result of what other competitors are providing, customers and especially enterprises are now demanding that flexibility and that self-servicing capabilities and automation from partners that they're working with. And also, many are building their own skills and are increasingly becoming programmers themselves. The third key driver that we wanted to highlight is the move to more complex value chains. And we'll touch upon this a little bit later in the panel session, but this is about shifting from traditional linear supplier models to more partnerships and ecosystems, which then require new skill sets and new processes and new systems and infrastructure and ways of working to enable this. And so, as I mentioned, agility is now more of a must-have in order to take advantage of enterprise opportunities that as yet have been imagined. And so the move to more agile processes and ways of working enables telcos to address new opportunities quickly as they arise. So for example, with network slicing, agility will be needed to manage a lot of the complexity that comes with this and the level of customization that is demanded from customers and is required. And so this is all about the ability to provide those customers with those capabilities in a very dynamic way and provide that visibility that they demand. Another trend as well that we are seeing is the interest in greater application and network integration. So especially as networks become increasingly accessible and programmable, this involves providing real-time network insights and instruction back to the network so that applications are much more network enabled. And this requires providing open yet secure interfaces and other capabilities such as identity and authentication, permissions, charging transactions, etc. And fundamentally, this change is all about providing agile network and IT systems that interact with one another rather than just react.
Thanks, Yasmin. I'll be taking you through our second kind of key takeaway, which is really about the what. So what the agility looks like in operators and how those kind of ideas that Yasmin mentioned have crystallized today. And I think what came out of our interview program that informs this research, and it's really more than just a set of practices. Agility today is much more pervasive. It touches kind of all aspects of an operator. And it's kind of this philosophy of speed of innovation at scale, so being able to iteratively scale things that are working and get rid of things that aren't, but without losing that carrier grade resilience. So that kind of meant in this came out of the interviews that we had this sort of balancing of what seemed to at first be quite conflicting concepts, so both flexibility and stability, and we saw that across 4 domains. The first one is a decoupled architecture. So that's the kind of the ideal that was ascribed to us of what an agile architecture looks like, with kind of abstracted capabilities down to their simplest, smallest components, available for use through APIs, both internally and externally to partners within these broader ecosystems. The emphasis here is on these being neutral, interchangeable, a very kind of modular model. This model by nature sort of implies flexibility, because you can orchestrate these neutral models quite flexibly, but actually at the control points or the intersections of the capabilities, that's where it needs to be very well controlled, standardized, with a degree of sort of structure and stability to make the whole work. And in this decoupled model, we found that it's BSS, so the business support models, along with its interaction with OSS and the network, that acts as the points of intersection, the kind of connective tissue that stitches the whole thing together. The second area that we sort of saw this balance needed was in governance. So here again, there's a kind of balance between being able to flexibly adapt to strategies that are working and failing fast, but you still need to keep that long-term view of strategy and have some stability in that in terms of that strategic direction. So there's a need to build flexibility in the system from the ground up, enabling autonomy in the workforce, while still having some top-down structure to kind of manage that in the longer term. A number of our interviewees really mentioned the need for buy-in from senior management, not just to sort of drive and start agility initiatives, but to really translate the strategic vision down to the lowest levels through systems of KPIs and OKRs as they're used. It's actually a kind of a point of uncertainty that came out of our interviews, this idea of KPIs, the ones who were further in their agility journeys, as we sort of found some discrepancy among interviewees in how they best measured agility. So some look to measure the degree to which they're agile. So they look at things like the adoption of initiatives or the level of reskilling, whereas others sort of try to capture the effect of being agile through mostly speed metrics, things like time to market, time to value, sometimes also simplification of their product portfolio. I think whichever camp they fell on, all interviewees sort of tended to agree that neither alone adequately fully captures what it means to be agile, and it seems to be an area that's still being worked on by those operators that are furthest ahead in their journeys. The third area is in terms of financial planning, and here the balance is around having procedures in place where you can quickly reallocate resources that can kind of quickly pivot around projects that are proving themselves and you'd like to scale, while reallocating away from those that aren't successful. Examples of this might kind of move to a quarterly financial planning model, or moving away from CapEx towards more an OpEx driven model. However, this kind of flexibility needs to be achieved without losing sight of longer term goals. So some of the kind of practical constraints of having to reallocate budget every quarter can kind of get in the way of that security of having a multi-year budget allocated to a project. I think this one's a sort of nuanced one to balance, and it's quite a fine balance. One interviewer described it as needing a guiding star, where you sort of unlock your medium-term planning. It becomes easier to commit to projects because you don't have to commit to a full year's budget. But you're also safe in the knowledge that frequent reallocations mean that the support will be there if it proves itself as successful and scalable. The last area that we saw this balance coming into play was in kind of project-based workforce, we've called it. So an organizational principle around projects. So these are the kind of usual words you see associated with agility. So tribes with cross-functional teams working to very fast 2-week sprints on specific projects and goals. The idea being that you accelerate the speed of your innovation, reduce the need for long approval processes across all the different business units, and just basically support this agile model. However, again here, there's a danger of losing sight of kind of longer term working processes, and it can kind of get in the way of a momentum built up by the team if the sights are set too short with just 2-week cycles. I think one interviewee was describing that in some of their project-based work teams, in the product teams, for example, there was not necessarily enough demand for a certain role to be a permanent member of a project-based tribe. So I think the example they gave were a marketing content person, not needed by every single product delivery team. So they might have to drift between a few different tribes. And they found that if you had too many of these sorts of roles that drift between the tribes versus a permanent tribe member, that really got in the way of the momentum that they were building up and kind of counterintuitively slowed down the sprint. I think they came to a sort of, by experiment, they came to a balance of about 70-30 split between permanent and more drifting roles. They found that as the ideal. So that's kind of the what. The next and the last part of our takeaways is the how. So how do you get there, and what kind of lessons can we see from some of those interviews that are more advanced in their journeys? Similarly to our report in 2015, we found that often operators are being held back in only a few areas of their organizations from really being able to achieve agility. And that can sort of have a disproportionate impact on the overall agility of their organizations. I think we use the phrase in our report, you're only as agile as your slowest limb. So it's important to tackle each area that could pose a barrier, and the one that's posing the most barrier is the one that should be tackled first. And we sort of, to kind of understand the process a bit better, we've split it out into 3 different groups: technology, product portfolio, organization, and culture. From our interviews, it became clear there were 2 main reasons that agile transformations were failing. So first is this idea I've just touched on about being disproportionately held back by lack of progress in any one part of the organization. So for example, having a particularly outdated IT stack or very slow organizational processes. And the other was when operators attempted really large scale agility transformations all at once that became redundant or outdated before they were able to be completed. So our conclusion from this was that driving an agility transformation should cover all 3 of our key areas in turn to stop any one effort getting bogged down or being too slow and stopping then other areas, and should be achieved stepwise. So basically what we're saying is that agile transformations should themselves be agile. And for this idea, we quite liked, as you can see on the slide, the image of a flywheel. This is a mechanical device which is designed to quite efficiently accelerate up to speed with only small incremental forces added one after the other until it eventually snowballs under its own momentum in quite a stable way. So that's the idea of our agility flywheel. And the idea in terms of agility is to focus on removing barriers to agility in each of the 3 areas in turn with a small little impetus that then builds the momentum of the flywheel until it sort of drives itself. So in each of those 3 areas, how might you achieve some removal of barriers? In technology, for example, it's about identifying the key areas holding back your speed, the worst offenders in your IT or networks, and then selectively updating and modularizing gradually individual stacks until you kind of drive towards that decoupled cloud native vision we outlined. In the product simplification area, it's about striking a balance between releasing new products and updating existing ones. So we kind of get closer to that software native business model and regularly shed the added costs of having customers on legacy products. And then finally, in the organization bucket, it's about sort of some of those things I've mentioned that are very classically seen as agile practices, about empowering employees, adopt that startup mentality of having greater autonomy to make decisions without long approval processes. The other key aspect of the flywheel analogy is it has quite a significant starting inertia that you need to overcome to get the process going. And we found some major external shocks can get that agility flywheel turning. So of course the pandemic came up a few times, but also market impacts such as more kind of digital native new entrants, as Yasmin mentioned. Then there are some slightly more slower burn pressures that can demand or force a reaction from an operator, and that can get the flywheel moving. So maybe a new leadership that really understands the aims of agility, or experimentation in areas of an organization less constrained by legacy, things such as in new acquisitions or greenfield sites. These slightly softer pushes is all not just about starting the agility, but really keeping it going in those early days. As even if an external systemic shock kind of sparks the urgency for driving it, you really need to keep pushing to get that flywheel turning and snowballing.
Sorry, you're on mute, Yasmin.
I realized I was mute. Yeah, before we turn into the panel session, we just wanted to highlight our 3 sort of broad recommendations for operators, and we'll dive into more of this in detail. So number 1, as Yannick mentioned, this is about developing a plan and a roadmap in order to drive that agility flywheel. So understanding and looking at modernizing and modularizing and doing sort of an exercise to rationalize your existing IT and network systems. The second one as well is more about this balance, this delicate balance that we've been hearing from operators on focusing on the new products and releasing new products versus evolving existing products and services, and understanding what are the metrics in order to drive and understand when to and how to maintain that balance. And then the third one is also establishing some of those structures and incentives and practices to provide your employees and your workforce with that autonomy and that control, and also be able to empower them to make decisions faster and to drive this within their organizations. The second recommendation that we had found was around identifying where agility efforts are best or have the highest impact. So one thing that we found is that these are often areas that require a lot of cross-team or cross-unit or cross-functional collaboration. And so this includes areas such as product development, where, for example, certain approvals or progress needs requires input and alignment from multiple different stakeholders within the organization. And that's where a lot of these agile initiatives tend to have the biggest impact, because that's where the biggest or the largest or greatest inertia is currently happening. And as we mentioned before, a lot of this has to be driven by senior leadership in order to clarify and communicate and articulate what that overall strategic vision is and that roadmap for your agility transformation, and then start to make this much more tangible for the workforce and at different levels as well. What does this look like in terms of their day-to-day mode of operations? What are some of the key metrics and goals and ambitions that they should be working towards, also incrementally in the short term, in the medium, and in the long term? And in order to dive into more of that detail, I will be handing it back over to Phil to get the thoughts of our panelists.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Yannick, for that overview. So I'd like now to sort of pass back some of the questions to our panelists. I'm going to start with Rosemary. Rosemary, I mean, you've been leading key agility initiative within Telia, and be interesting to know, where did you put Telia on the poll?
I would say thank you, and thanks for an excellent summary of the study as well. It's spot on, really. I would say that we are moving towards a 4, so between like 3 and 4. And with that said, we have invested quite, much time and effort to go towards the 4. We have, as many companies, I think, and many operators, been working, agile in those islands, and also the term agile was almost hijacked by IT for many years, right? And then But now we have a clear understanding that this needs to involve more parties. It's about now technology parts, the stacks at the lowest parts once the technology is evolving as it is, and the product dimension and ITs, all these parts together. And that is kind of the change that we are now making to get the end-to-end perspective in place, because it's when we get that we can actually get the benefits out of Agile. It's not about having 1 or 2 teams or like 100 dispersed teams. It's about getting them together. And just the last note on that, we have also made a clear decision that in order to structure this journey within Telecompany, we have looked at various but chosen one Agile framework to support that journey in order to create the structure, the language, and make it a more methodic way of implementing our next Agile steps, I would say.
So, in addition to putting that framework, adopting a framework, a language, a methodology, what are the other key steps you would advise operators take in order to drive that agility?
I would say the first one of the first things. I mean, there are some practical things I'd like to emphasize, but overall, I'd like to. There's some kind of overall umbrella under the word of understanding what this is all about, right? And one of the things I already mentioned, that it's not an IT journey. It's about combining the different parties that need to be part in this end-to-end construction in order to make agility work. That is, first of all, you need to scope this in a proper way in order to get out the benefits. I will also say that it's not only about the delivery dimension. I think sometimes we fool ourselves by thinking that, okay, we have like the agile delivery platforms with the teams and the frameworks and so on, but it's even more, I would say, also to look at the same time on the enabling structures, meaning that you need to change the funding principles in order to support this kind of ways of working. You need to change how management actually, controls and steers. You came into that, OKRs and so on. So, and that is a key part, I think, that you need to start off with at the same time, basically, because that's a long process in companies having a history of kind of managing the operations in a completely different way. And then the third thing I think one also need to address, and it's more on the softer term in terms of leadership dimensions and so on, because agility means empowering the lowest level, right? You need to empower the teams. You need to make the decision where they're best fitted, and that means that management tasks are onwards changing, and they need to both dare and understand how that can be addressed. Then on the very practical note, I think we made up a few things like choosing an agile framework and implementing that in kind of a hub and spokes model according to recommendation. I think that is one important part. Another key thing we made was that we actually created a common cadence cross over the company. So very early we said that here we're working for program increments, right? Here is the planning weeks. Everybody plans in this time. We know that we prepared the month before. So all these dependencies that we have in companies with legacy setups can be handled and treated in a good way, and then dare to start in the small setups.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And I hope that Rosemary, you saw a lot of that in the report, because you were one of the people who participated. Thank you again for taking part, and some really good insights there, some very practical guidance on key things to put in place around frameworks, but also getting that communication, getting the understanding. Agility is not an IT thing, it's a company-wide thing, and empowering the folks and the mechanisms by which you drive that through. So thanks for sharing that. I'd actually like to turn to Etisham. And Etisham, you've been working a lot more closely with growing new ecosystems and adopting ecosystem approaches to innovation. And how important is this concept of agility from your point of view in enabling that move to more eco-centric models?
Oh, it's thanks, Phil. I think it's a fantastic kind of an advert for something like this to be happening, because with ecosystems, just as your findings from the report, you're looking at, you're breaking away from the traditional standardized approach on bringing partners into an equation, that is more sort of a, you know, run of the mill, versus getting people on board on their own terms in a more kind of a loose relationships in which you have a lot more control with the partners and their stakes much higher within that ecosystem. And so I think that it's a very relevant discussion. You know, agility, you know, as long as there's only one party involved in driving all the decisions, all the time in the world at the disposal of their management, versus 5 partners all have a skin in the game and they need to get somewhere together, then it's no longer one person's agenda. And so ecosystems are that way of thinking is extremely important from an agility perspective, and particularly from the 5G discussion we're having now. You know, so you have these new business models which require you to think about much more partner stake in the game, and then you want to lay out the blueprint in a way that they have much more, you know, sort of, you know, control, and hence the need for agility. So, you know.
And which aspects of agility would you highlight as being critical for operators to put in place so that they can better participate or even build their own ecosystems?
Great question. So I think that if you look at the flywheel, it's such a good descriptor of how this is actually how you see this working across a whole spectrum of operators. So you have a clockwise configuration here, and it's for a reason. So for example, you go in from a cloudification concept where you're saying, you know, you're being more and more cloudified, you know, whether you were just virtualized networks to now IT systems and a lot of hyperscaler relationships, and even talks of, you know, having a much more cloudified network and IT than say even a year ago, you know, because we're seeing the business models to evolve in that direction. And so that needs to then lead into an agile kind of product dev and a more modular and a more simplified portfolio that Yannick talked about. And that further leads into a more CI/CD approach, which is embedded in the organization. So what you're doing is, as the flywheel goes around, it's spurring on the next stage in the cycle, rather than what was before, these componentized approaches of trying to fix the organization, right? Some, you know, some people evangelizing pieces of the puzzle and then going after trying to be more DevOpsy when the whole thing is not even cloudified. So you had these, you know, so broken kind of a chain approach. But with this, you're now looking to actually have a more structured kind of a journey approach, which we will see more and more, and which I have seen more and more as we've spoken to a lot of people as they embark on this journey, is that it kind of is taking that direction, that trajectory, and that's where the significance of this is. As you get ready for the next stage, you tend to then develop those competencies, and therefore this whole thing has to be about organizational capabilities around those steps.
Okay, no, thanks for that, and yeah, thanks for also sort of putting in context of the flywheel. And you know, would you sort of make any recommendations about any specific steps you'd call out, or you just say, look at the flywheel, come in where you think you can, or is there any way you would say, look, get this one thing right, or get these 2 things right? Any kind of easy things you'd highlight for operators, particularly those looking to adopt a more ecosystem-centric model and develop innovation around 5G, around cloudification? Any kind of key guidance you'd offer?
Yeah, so Phil, the playbook, the ecosystem playbook catalyst is what this was all about, is to say, is there a playbook out there? Is there a way that we could kind of give you a few steps that would help, you know? So turns out there isn't, right? So there's like, I should say there's probably too many, right? So there's a lot of them around. And the thing that I would, you know, if you ask me in particular, I would say, you know, yes, the flywheel is great, but also think about, you know, how can you create an opportunity within your telco organization to make this a business-led project? How can you get the business leaders within your organization to start thinking about ecosystem business models? Once you start thinking about business models and your business leadership is bought in, the tech will follow beautifully because you're going to be adopting, not inventing. It's all out there already. So it's just a matter of business leaders bringing in the business models, understanding it, and then just giving it the leadership that it needs to drive that.
Good. Well, I hope some of them are listening, and I think it's a really good point, and I think it was a point echoed in a lot of the interviews we heard for this research is leadership either initiating or at least strongly supporting and backing agile initiatives is critical. And I'd like to follow on some of your comments about enabling and ask Miriam, who Ericsson obviously working with a lot of operators, and how do you see this move to agile manifesting itself with what customers are asking of Ericsson, Miriam?
So, well, I hope I could be heard because I had some challenges.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, good. So what we're seeing is an overarching theme of customer experience. We're getting a lot of requests to support our customers, have brilliant customer experiences, have the best customer experience, have seamless customer experience, or maybe just digitalized customer experience. So that's the kind of overarching theme that we're seeing, and that applies across the network, across the BSS, OSS connection points, and in BSS itself with all of those interactions. So what we're seeing is that there have been, and this kind of ties into your poll question there earlier, there have been many efforts toward agility, and agility is very often something that is being sought, in movements toward cloud, in digital transformation initiatives. But there's also been, I think, a slight shift in recent years where all of the efforts to date have been tremendous learning experiences to realize that actually the connection points are so great that until things are better aligned and until there are wider scale initiatives in place that have that top level support that's been mentioned a couple of times already, then there's the ability to go deeper with a specific target in mind, whether that's working through a prepaid stack or taking on one particular. So the guiding star language makes a lot of sense here as well, because that's what it looks like we're seeing. We're seeing concerted efforts to consolidate. We're seeing concerted efforts to remove chunks of legacy and clean up the current situation that is the BSS stack. And it makes a lot of sense because all of that tidying up that can be done now with today's services, that kind of frees up a little breathing room and frees up a little space to do all the experimentation that needs to come when we think about partner ecosystems like Edisham's been talking about. There's a lot of new there, and there's a lot of experimentation that needs to happen. So any breathing space is going to give everybody a fighting chance to get to the next stage. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, what we're seeing. Customer experience up at the very top, and an all-encompassing customer experience, and even extending out to improving the employee experience and making sure that employees can do what they need to do to process more transactions, to deal with more people, to get what they need to do done quicker, easier, faster.
Just before I ask the panel a few more questions, I just want to remind the audience to submit their questions. You should be able to find a little Q&A panel. If you open it up and submit your questions, we will look to try and answer your questions. I've had a few come in, but I would like to invite the audience to submit more questions. And as I say, if we don't get around to answering your question today, we will seek to do so in the coming days and send out all our responses to participants. But coming back to the panel, Edisham mentioned, Miriam, the shift to cloudification that's occurring. I was wondering what you were seeing in terms of the shift to cloud, and to what extent that had changed or increased the relevance of these agility concepts, particularly with regards to enterprise and the ecosystems that support new enterprise opportunities. That's for you, Miriam, sorry.
Just unmuting myself with a tremendous slow motion, apologies. So yeah, cloud is integral to everything that's going to be happening on the ecosystem. And it's especially integral if the volume and variety of services is going to change in the way we believe that it is. So there's going to come a point where whatever workarounds, whatever connection points that aren't as smooth as you'd like them to be, whatever is in place today that can be managed in a manual way, by applying effort to it, there's going to come a point where things have to happen automatically. So we see it all as, you know, intrinsically linked. There is, you know, while there's many different approaches to cloud, the one thing that comes out really clearly in terms of, and this is what I meant earlier when I said when we ask people why they're engaging in digital transformation, and has been for years, agility is what they say they want. When we ask people what it is they expect to get out of cloud, agility is what they want. So it's this ability to be able to granularize everything from infra to software as a service, but every aspect of it, and the network is becoming more granularized as well. It's all pointing toward the same kind of very rapid changes being made, as opposed to those old cycles that went on for months, if not years, to obtain even the slightest changes. This is true agility in terms of having fresh software landing in as often as it needs to get whatever needs to be done, right?
Thank you. I'm just going to keep inviting people to submit their questions. In the meantime, I'd like to come back to Rosemary and just ask, Telia's been working on this agility for a while. What would you say your key achievements have been in this agility journey that you're most proud of? And how do you measure achievement in agility?
I think that if I start at the last part of your question, I think we are still in, as you also stated at the beginning, under establishment of measuring agility success. We are the metrics we follow currently are much on the delivery side, being PI accuracy, future throughput, how far on the speed and the time to market type of metrics, right? We are establishing an OKR type of model, so we actually will also be following it from a more long-term perspective on the objectives we want to achieve. And I think from the performance and the success, I think it has not been very long. It just kind of during the recent year and a half, where we took a more holistic approach, more broad approach across BUs, countries, markets, and like the factory with the product and network development and so on, to actually include all parts of the value chain into our journey. And what I think we have, and that is of course in large corporations, it's a complex task, right, to perform. But I think we have been very good in being quite specific on how we want to drive this, in the sense that we have appointed key persons in driving that, in the sense like, one head per unit driving this kind of journey, meaning that basically if you gather 10 people in a room, you get the all over dimension to how to perform this. So, and they can reach out to they have the management team attention, and they can reach out and actually, drive the implementation for real. And I think this kind of and it's like virtual type of networks that are so pointed at and empowered, so we actually managed to start off in all aspects in the same time, because that's one of my fears actually. How do you actually transform large corporations? I mean, super hard, but I think that has been one of the things that where we actually can prove that we are more and more aligning across the end-to-end value streams. But then,
great.
Yeah.
No, thank you for that. I think we started getting some questions in, but before we just got maybe a minute left before we move on to the Q&A, I'm just going to ask Eteshan a little bit about his experience of what are the specific aspects that you think are key to success that you could point to. What are you proud of? What are the key steps that you would point to in terms of driving new ecosystems and agility?
So I think I'm very proud that we've worked with a couple of very large CSPs in helping them deliver a ecosystem blueprint, sort of going in with a business capabilities roadmap that can be then used for relationships with hyperscalers and bring in some new IoT-driven business models and try and see how the new business models will actually work inside this existing very kind of standardized organization. How are you going to do these really kind of far out models with them? So I'm really keenly looking at not just those blueprints coming out and a lot of debate and a lot of resistance in some corners, a lot of acceptance in others, and a lot of movement forward. All I see is forward motion. And so that's good news. However, I would say that the relationships, the thing to look at is the relationships with hyperscalers as it emerges with this 5G debate. You see the Azure and AT&T thing happening, with all these new business models coming out. I have a few examples of a few other relationships with hyperscalers coming mostly out of North America, how that's shaping the next debate about how this is so verticalized. No one implementation is going to look like the other. And so this is really exciting in terms of, seeing that this is happening and that this is the direction that it will take mostly. And this opens up this agility debate from the CSP's perspective. And I think that they are increasingly finding more relevance in this discussion, as opposed to maybe they were just going to be bystanders and the hyperscalers were going to come in and tell everyone what to do, but it's not how it's turning out. The CSPs are coming up with their blueprints. They're coming up with a lot of product discussions. They're coming up with the stakes, and they're delivering on it. And so there's a lot going on out there, which is good news in this regard.
Great, thank you all. So I'm now going to turn to some of the questions that have started coming in. Thank you for those of you who have started submitting the questions. And I would like to start with a question for you, Rosemary, from Lukman. Thank you for the question. The question that's been posed here is, were you focused on hiring some of the key people from technology firms who have been for a long time in terms of organizational agility, have experience to feed the questions of transformation? Or, I guess, and this isn't Lukman, this is me adding something, or were you more focused on upskilling internal skills?
Super important and relevant question. Thank you. No, that has not been like a focus on its own to do that. But as the maturity grew within the company of understanding more of the agile logic, the DevOps principles, softwareization, etc., the competence base was expanded. We also did some kind of forklift type of task by using consultants in some parties, but the greatest effort has been actually to work with the internal workforce and train basically train the internal workforce to be able to support and drive this transformation. And that is a challenging task. So it's super important that you actually put a lot of time on identifying the transformation leaders, the people, not the leaders in the formal leading positions, more the leaders that can actually drive this kind of journey from inside out perspective, that have the competence to drive change, and you can find them wherever in the organization, and then put some effort and cherish these kind of key drivers in this. We chose SAFe, Scale Agile Framework, for our journey, and then we have a LACE and hub. We have a LACE model for implementing this with a central hub, and then we have spokes in all the different units driving that. It's like virtual teams, and to identify the right spokes has been a key part here, for example.
Great, no, thank you, Rosemary. I'm conscious of time. There's a question here. It's I think I'm going to direct this one to Miriam. And the question is, on the consumer side, we see lots of self-service, various automation, and even some introduction of AI, but not so much of this in large enterprise customers, and where the stack is often seen to have changed very little in recent years. What do you think needs to happen within sort of enterprise IT and BSS stack to make it more agile?
So yeah, that's a great question. And I think the question, it's halfway there, the question itself. I think the enterprise stack needs to look a lot more like the consumer stack. And I think that the things that have been deemed not necessary on the enterprise side, because there's been this tradition of white glove treatment, or incredibly kind of personalized account management, particularly for the large enterprises. I think, again, down to the numbers that we're looking at for what's going to be coming with 5G and beyond, I think we're going to need to see a lot more surfaceable items coming up from the product catalog in terms of recommendations, whether that is self-service or facilitated by an agent. There needs to be a lot more AI automation. There needs to be a lot more accessibility to information that would normally only be surfaced in very manual ways. And I think we also, we're seeing an increasing need for more real time, not just for charging or rating, but also for billing. There's more and more requests from particularly large enterprises to get a better view forward of what the bill cycle that we're currently in, what that's going to look like at the end of it. And again, getting predictions together around that. So a lot more. The good thing here is that there's heaps that's happened on the consumer side that's applicable, right? And then, one thing that's interesting here is to what extent could things reasonably or sensibly be consolidated. And if we look at somebody like Vivo in Brazil, so Telefónica's big LATAM outlet in Brazil, that they're moving toward a massive consolidation on the rating side that includes prepaid, postpaid, and includes enterprise consumer. It's literally everything, the 100 million. So I think, and a question I like asking at the moment is to what extent, like, where does consolidation have to stop? What really needs to be separate at this point in time moving forward, and what's achieved? What's achieved by consolidating more.
And some of this goes back to this flywheel and the need for simplification, rationalization, not just of the products and services, but of the supporting infrastructure.
Absolutely.
Thank you for that, Miriam. And Etishant, there's another question I'd like to direct this one to you, Etishant, from Lukman, who's been quite prolific. Thank you for all the questions. This question here is, what are some of the challenges in running composite structure, agile on the delivery and functional matrix on the other part? So where do you see challenges in trying to introduce these composite structures of agile delivery and functional on other parts?
Right, so that's an excellent question. So I think that, but again, no playbooks, but what I would suggest is that as we, in Yannick's discussion, one of the key aspects of the frameworks that go into something like this is to think about the open digital architecture, to think about remember the discussion about how you're transforming into a decoupling of the hard parts within the architecture, and you're going into a more flexible, modularized architecture. And what you're seeing is a composite kind of a development of various types of frameworks coming in, both from the business side, the enterprise side, and the technology side. And you're trying to bring the best of breed with the new experiences, and you're trying to create around, and you could choose any type of whether it's ODA, telco architectures, or IT for IT, or you could use number of other standards to go about doing the work that you're doing. But you'll see a lot of convergence around the telco architecture that starts to look a lot like the rest of the world, right? So you're going into this modular approach, more cloud-like approach. But then for the business architecture work, a lot of the work is already kind of new in the rest of the world as well, and it's coming in. And when you think about the business model driven organizational architecture, that's starting to happen. One thing that I would recommend seriously when you go into this is to start looking at some of the ecosystem work that's going on in Silicon Valley around growth, and just growth modeling in general from a business perspective, to understand how the various aspects of various moving parts in an organization or an ecosystem come together around growth, so that you can visualize your business models around some of the elements that actually spur on that growth. And then how can you make that connection with your ODA, or you can make that connection with the enterprise architecture, how everything is set up, how your BSSI OSS is set up, how your network is going to be, whatever the transitional architecture for your network is. Can that actually be integrated with that ecosystem architecture, which is driven by growth? If you can do that, then in between you have some transitional space in which you can see how you're going to make those prioritized decisions around your own journey, right? So you're going to take a bit longer in some parts, but much shorter than others in some parts, because you're hooking that up with an ideal, which is growth in your markets or whatever it is that you're trying to do. It's now hooking up to your enterprise. So I would say, there really aren't many playbooks out there that would tell you which frameworks will work best or how it's going to fit right into a theoretical, organization architectural principles. But what you will find is that a lot of the growth architectures are coming in. A lot of the business architecture is starting to shape up. A lot of the ecosystem thinking about architecture is coming in, and all of this is having a lot of impact on enterprise architecture and the way you have always thought about how putting your stuff up. And you have a much more multi-dimensional view into what you're doing, the decisions you're taking. So I hope that I didn't confuse.
No, thank you for that. And I'm conscious of time. I've got a quick question here that's come in for Rosemary, which is, what's next for Telia on your agile journey?
It's to continue the hard work, I would say, and to actually, increase the knowledge of each business capability that is needed, because basically we have starting points now, and as we speak, we're just kind of within the domain I'm working for on a daily basis. We started off in a limited setup with a number of teams. We're expanding that setup now. So I think that what we need to keep in mind is this, the continuous change and the continuous improvement work that is kind of we have in front of us, basically.
Great, and I think we are sort of coming up to the top of the hour. So it leaves me to thank our panelists for taking part and to thank our presenters. Thank you, the audience, for joining us. Thank Ericsson that sponsored this webinar and also sponsored the research. I urge you to download the full report and get the details. And I also urge you to share the link to this webinar for your colleagues to take a look at it. We will be sending out the presentation as well as the links to the report and as well as a more detailed set of responses to the questions that you submitted. Thank you all for taking part and have a good day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.